Okay, so when we left, we ended our journey at Murrayfield Stadium. And here is where we entered the city proper. And today we are starting out with one of the many bridges across the river, but not for the bridge itself. Long ago, in days of yore, Roseburn was known as Colt Bridge, not to be confused with Coat Bridge. Why the area went from being known as Colt Bridge to Roseburn, I don't know, but its old name lends itself to a rather interesting event in its history. On the older of the two bridges over the river, you will find a plaque talking about something known as the Colt Bridge Canter. This plaque gives a brief description of the event, but does so in a rather cold and boring way, so I guess it's up to me to talk about the event in some more detail. For those curious, I got this account from events from the 1941 issue of the Journal for the Society for Army Historical Research on JSTOR, so I will be accounting that in my own words. So the year is 1745.
How I wish I was in Sherbrooke now.
Bonnie Prince Charlie has arrived in Scotland, has just taken Perth and was ready to take Edinburgh. The main government forces, led by one Sir John Cope, left the lowlands for Inverness. Bad idea on their part, because the Jacobites made a beeline for Edinburgh, dodging Stirling, and by the 15th of September were at Kirkliston. Now let's turn our attention to the government forces in Edinburgh. There was a garrison in the castle, but the city's defence was made up of the 13th and 14th Dragoons, the Edinburgh Volunteers, who were literally volunteers who were just given guns, and the Town Guard, who were armed night watchmen who were the predecessor to the police. The 13th and 14th Dragoons were not hardened troops, but were rather made up of rather green recruits with little combat experience. The 13th Dragoons were originally based in Corstorphine, but when they heard that Kirkliston had been captured, they moved back to Colt Bridge, modern day Roseburn, to meet with the 14th and defend the likely route into the city. The Jacobites took Corstorphine, and upon doing so decided the next stop was obviously Edinburgh, but they didn't go down Corstorphine Road, that would be too obvious. Instead, they gathered their troops at Gray's Mill. Where is Gray's Mill? Well, today it's the Imperial Palace Chinese Restaurant and Matthew's Chinese Market. Should I call them up and tell them so they can put up a little plaque? Anyway, once gathered there, Charlie sent a troop of mounted scouts down the road to, well, scout the route. And on the route onto the city, they encountered the Town Guard. The Town Guard shot themselves and, without returning fire, ran in the opposite direction towards Colt Bridge, at which point they told these very green recruits that the Jacobites were nearby. And in turn, they shot themselves and fled towards Preston Pans along what is today Princes Street in front of the whole city. Literally, everyone saw the troops just hightailing it out of town. The government troops were so panicked that apparently they kept falling into old mine shafts and losing their guns and equipment, which the Jacobites picked up along the way towards the Battle of Preston Pans. Now remember when I had mentioned the force led by Sir John Cope? Well, they heard about Charlie's race to Edinburgh, and upon hearing this rerouted to Aberdeen in hopes that they could take a boat to Leith. But by this point it was too late, and the Jacobites took Edinburgh with minimal resistance. Let's talk about the modern art galleries. Modern art, despite it being technically an era that's past, with us being in an era known as the contemporary art era, sometimes gets a bad rap. The museum even has an article framed, outraged, that the National Galleries of Scotland had acquired works by Roy Lichtenstein, who created artwork in a pulp comic style. But what about before it was an art gallery? Well, Modern 1, the one with the big landform in front of it, used to be John Watson's institution, and Modern 2, formerly known as the Dean Gallery, or the one of all the Eduardo Pelosi works, used to be the Dean Orphanage. Yes, a school and an orphanage. So let's start with Modern 1, shall we? So in 1762, John Watson, an Edinburgh solicitor and writer to the Signet, left the residue of his estate for charitable purposes for the children in the Edinburgh area. A refuge was established, which eventually became John Watson's institution. The building itself was built in 1825 by William Byrne, who, amongst other works, designed Inverness Castle, the Melville Monument, and St John's Church on the corner of Lothian Road and Princess Street. So, to say he left his architectural mark is a little bit of an understatement. I've already spoken about the children's graveyard at the back of the building, which, paired with the orphanage across the road, addresses who the school was aimed at: orphans and the destitute. Here, children weren't merely taught the free hours, but also skills that might get them employment on the outside, as it were. The school itself closed in 1975, and in 1984 the organisation was changed by Parliament to the John Watson's Trust to distribute funds from the sale of its assets. The building of the school, as we all know, became the Scottish Gallery of Modern Art. The first home of the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art was in Leith House in the Botanical Gardens, which it moved to in 1960. But in 1984 it moved to the John Watson's Institution's former building. Leith House is still an art gallery, but for contemporary art, and is run by the gardens themselves. But what about the Dean Gallery, also known as Modern 2, also known as the one with the Pelosi stuff in it? Well, this gallery used to be the orphanage. The building was built between 1831 and 33 by Thomas Hamilton, and it was considered rather grand for an orphanage. It was built of Craigleaf stone, and alongside being a home for children, it also provided children with instruction in different trades so they can get work in the outside world. What's interesting is that we know the name of the last person to leave the home, mainly because, as far as I know, he is still alive. Or at least he lived long enough to write about it on the internet. His name was Donald Campbell Veal, and after leaving the home he went to live with his sister. Today it is a modern art gallery and very much worth the visit, even if you're not too into art. Now we've spoken about the Dean Orphanage, let's talk about the Dean Village. The Dean Village is one of the most photographed places in the city, mainly because it's very Instagrammable. It's one of those places that blog posts talk about like nobody knows about it, when in reality there's 100 other posts saying the exact same thing. It is admittedly very beautiful. It folds into the landscape, but like everything else in the Water of Leith, the area has more of an industrial heritage than you would expect. Maps of the area from the 19th century show the area being full of mills, smithies, and most importantly, a distillery. The Sunbury Distillery was opened in 1813 and closed in 1856, and it was a substantial distillery, especially for the area, with its own coopers and excise office. But what about the place itself? The Dean Village was first mentioned in 1145, when the lands of the village were granted to Holyrood Abbey. It remained a separate village until surprisingly recently, namely the 19th century. In 1826, the lands were purchased by John Learmouth from the Nisbet of Dean. In 1833, Thomas Telfer's Dean Bridge was opened to traffic over the Dean Gorge and plays a key role in Strip Jack by Ian Rankin, wherein a woman is found dead under the bridge. Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, the Dean went into a decline that peaked in the 1960s, and the area became known for deprivation and decay, which is absolutely shocking to me because the whole area looks like it belongs in a Studio Ghibli movie. This changed throughout the 70s as redevelopment began, and it is now one of Edinburgh's most desirable area and usually full of tourists when it's warm. And that is where we're going to leave things for the glorious time being. All hail the time being. Join us next time as we head up the river.